Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane. I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts, and I'm very excited to be here with Professor Brian Conley of Suffolk University, who's going to be talking to us about the origins and evolution of Project 2025, something that's been in the news a lot, and we want to know what it's actually about. We want to know facts and figures and basically the truth of how it came about. So we're going to be Professor Connolly is going to be doing his slides, and we'll be here for about an hour. We will have time for questions at the end. So if you have questions for Brian, please put them in the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of your screen. During his talk, I'm going to be closing the chat and so that it's not distracting to anybody, and we can all listen in on the slides. And then at the end, like I said, we'll do a Q&A. If I do want to say thank you to the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programs. We couldn't do these things without them. And Brian agreed to let us share this with other libraries, because when libraries work together, we make magic. And and I think this is a very important program that a lot of libraries and communities signed on for. So I'm really pleased with that. So Brian Connolly, as I said, is it's a professor and chair of the Political Science and Legal Studies Department at Suffolk University. I think this is your first year's chair, so I am so impressed that you had time tonight to be with us as well, in addition to all of everything else you do. Welcome, Brian. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me. And I want to welcome everybody who's joining, and I look forward to a good conversation. So I think the general structure that we've kind of agreed upon is that I'll provide the slides and review the slides, and then we'll have a Q&A. So I look forward to people's questions. So I was asked, to talk about Project 2025. I'm a person who I study U.S. politics. I study political parties, political organizations, also political communication. I've written on numbers of different things, including several books on political communication, as well as actually books on political parties, specifically the Republican Party. So I've analyzed and written about the post-war Republican Party, post-World War II, that is. So the talk that we're giving tonight is called The Origins and the Evolution of Project 2025. And so, being a professor, I always like to provide an agenda. So what are we going to do? We're going to look at the rise of the Republican right, again, post-war US. So, I could go back as far as people want, but I'll kind of restrict myself to late 70s, early 80s on. We're going to talk a little bit about what a political party is, because it's actually kind of critical to the discussion of if you want to understand Project 2025, you got to understand actually the Republican Party. You got to understand how it functions and the particular factions within it. So that's one of the things we're going to look at is Republican factions between 1960s to the present. And I'm going to look specifically at one called conservatives, but specifically corporate conservatism. And then I'm going to talk about what's called the mandate for leadership, which is actually what the Project 2025 is. It's called the mandate for leadership. And then specifically, we'll look at this version of it, because as we're going to see in a second, Project 2025 is actually the 9th edition of the mandate for leadership. The first one was published in 1981. So that's what we're going to do today. So let me just start with a little bit of background. And again, like I said, I won't go too far into the history, although I like to go into the history, but I'm going to go back a little bit to the 60s and 70s. In 1980, George Will said about the 1964 and 1980 elections, comparatively speaking, he said that Barry Goldwater, the Republicans' 1964 presidential nominee, actually won the election. It just took 16 years to count the vote, right? So now 16 between 1964 and 1980. So this was this idea, and there was this broad idea of kind of a Republican renaissance between 68 and 80. Of course, it was a tough time to be a Republican in the early 70s, but the rise, particularly within the Republican Party, of a more conservative branch of the Republican Party. So Barry Goldwater being kind of one of the most outspoken conservative nominees that ever got the nomination in 1964, and then fast forward to 1980 with Ronald Reagan, and this is kind of what Will is referencing, is like, hey, these are very similar candidates, and it also speaks to the fact that this particular faction within the Republican Party had become kind of dominant. So that's kind of where we're going to begin. I'm going to skip over some of this data because, I'm not sure we have time, but I will, if anybody has any detailed questions, I can go back to it. So it is this question about like, okay, so what happened, two big questions. What happened to political parties from the 1960s into, say, the 1980s, but then specifically what happened within the Republican Party. Now, 1964, that was actually the greatest landslide defeat in a presidential election up until that point. Lyndon Johnson, completely defeated, very, very systematically defeated Goldwater. But nonetheless, despite Goldwater's loss, his nomination indicated the rise of the right and conservative movements or factions within the Republican Party. And those groups actually remained strong and then became even more dominant despite that presidential loss, which is kind of an interesting historical puzzle that people have looked at. But what I want to talk about is that there was these discussions back then about, how did the right become more successful in the Republican Party in the 1960s and 70s up to the 80s and then going forward. And one of them was about this whole discussion about the pace of social change in the 1960s. There was also these theories about white backlash against, white working class backlash against liberalism. And these have looked at various types of sociological variables to understand how parties function. So I'm actually what you call a historical institutionalist. I study inside parties. I don't look at the forces outside of them. I'm more concerned about the forces inside of them. And so what I'm going to kind of look at today is what I call an organizational rather than a sociological analysis of parties. And you're going to see why this matters because, again, Project 2025 is going to fit specifically into certain factional elements within the Republican Party. So you can see here the red box. In IR theory, they often talk about something called the black box. That is, they used to not look at states and look how states kind of interact with each other. Well, the study of parties is kind of similar. We would look at just how parties interact with each other, but we wouldn't go into them. We wouldn't dive into them. So that's really what I'm going to do. I'm going to take this red box and I'm going to open it up. When I do that, whenever you open up a political party, you're opening up the question, well, what is a political party? And this is going to be the most scientific slide of the presentation. A party, I would describe a political party as a bag, or in this case, a box of cats. That's what they are. Unfortunately, in the Middle Ages and throughout history, they used to often beat up on cats and be mean to them. They'd throw in bags and they'd tease them and stuff like that, which is terrible. But this is kind of what a political party is. It's like you put a bunch of bags and put a bunch of cats in a bag and you kind of poke it, and what happens? Well, these cats seem to be getting along, but allow it to be conflicts. And in the United States, we don't really have very strong parties. We have parties or coalitions. They're coalitions of different groups. So again, it'd be like a box of different groups, like in this case, they're a box of different cats. And again, like I say, I'm impressed by these cats. They're quite friendly to each other. But that's what's happening. Now, 1950s on, what did we have? In the Republican Party, you had several different factions. You had what's called the moderates, the progressives, the conservatives, and the stalwarts. And now, again, if you go see I'm going to look at this from the 1950s into the 1980s, the progressives were the most liberal. The moderates were kind of what we used to call Rockefeller Republicans or Eastern Establishment Republicans or Wall Street Republicans. And then there were the stalwarts, which were sometimes called the Old Guard or the Taft Republicans. And then there were the conservatives. And the conservatives, to a significant degree, when we use the word conservatism in the United States, we're referring really to a faction in the Republican Party that emerged in the mid-1950s, specifically during the Cold War with the rise, and also with the rise of a series of intellectual conservative thinkers post-World War II, and with the development of, say, significant political publications like the National Review. But what happens here is, and I'll give you a little breakdown of what these different groups think. You'll see, so the commonalities within these factions within the party is private over public solutions, so less rather than more government, and implicitly often more nationalist foreign policy, although that's not always the case. But we see here we have a left-right divide and we have a center. So the left, progressives, were the rhinos. Government could be an instrument for social good. These are the progressives. So rhino, again, is kind of a critique that people have of sometimes Republican in name only, but these are most progressive, closest to the Democratic Party. The moderates, Eastern Establishment, they were supporters of good, efficient, and pragmatic government. Technocrats, corporate perspective of government, very much linked to, like they said, the Eastern Establishment, so it'd be like the New York City-based kind of power structure. Stalwarts, again, more Midwestern, more small business, more fiscally conservative, small town, small business, and they tended to have some isolationist tendencies prior to World War II. Conservatives, as I mentioned too before, they emerged in the 1950s. They are a group that is actually more ideological than partisan. That is, they're more committed to a particular ideological worldview than they are to the Republican Party. But for example, like profoundly anti-communist, deeply opposed to the New Deal and all of its spin-offs, New Frontier, whatever, Great Society, oppose all of that stuff implicitly across the board. So here they are, and you can see what I'm going to do here is do a little time lapse thing. So in the 1950s, you have a relative distribution like this. In the 60s, what happens is the conservatives and the stalwarts combine. And then slowly over time, actually, then the progressives somewhat disappear by the 1970s. And then you really only have two groups. And that's by the 1970s and 80s, you have the moderates and the conservatives are becoming more dominant. So by the 1990s, certainly by, say, the Republican Revolution of 94, the conservatives have become the dominant cat, right? If you want to go back to my bag of cats, which I want to make very clear, I'm a very passionate animal lover. So I don't say that fondly, but just as a historical reference and as a description of the phenomenon. But they would be the dominant cat. They're the dominant faction in the coalition. And so who are the conservatives? Well, there's three legs to the conservative stool. One is what we call libertarianism. This is a belief system that's based on the individual liberty, and a limited or no state at all, limited government. The second group is what we call traditionalists, and they have a belief system that rests on family and religious life, social order and hierarchy in society, and a moral state. Then there's the last group, what I call corporatists, or you might call them corporate conservatives. They have a belief system that's based on the free market system, corporate power, and a pro-business regulatory state. So if you pause here for a minute, I'm going to elaborate on this. You're going to see that you might sense that at times these groups disagree, and they do. They disagree. I'll tell you that the libertarians and the traditionalists often disagree, and the corporatists often kind of stand to the side and let those two kind of, struggle over different ideas and then see what happens. So what happens? How does this translate into public policy? Well, libertarians, traditionalists, and corporatists. Again, these are the sub-factions within conservatism, and that's the conservative right faction within the Republican Party. They believe in small government and individual rights in the free market. They believe in religious beliefs and restrictive social policy. And what I mean by that, things like restrictions on marriage, restriction on gender now, restrictions on abortion. But they also believe in limited regressive taxes and what we call social regulations. So social regulations are things like environmental regulations, OSHA, workplace, and consumer rights. This is a phenomenon that actually emerged in the 70s, I'm sorry. So here you have it again, right? So some, even more specifically, the libertarians believe in limited government. The traditionalists believe in strong moral government. And the corporatists believe in strong limited government. So now again, here you can see where there might be some conflicts and disagreements. How do you have one group wants limited government, another one wants strong moral government, and then the third one wants actually some type of strong government, but limited, strong in some places, limited in others. One place that I specifically look at, and this is the direct tie to Project 2025, or the mandate for leadership, is that the mandate for leadership, again, originally published in 1981 and written in the summer of 1980 for the Reagan administration, is very much, it is a blueprint for the executive branch of government. And it was primarily focused on the regulatory state and the executive agencies. So the independent and semi-independent regulatory agencies that were either created by the executive branch or mostly created by Congress, that the executive branch would regulate in some particular way. Because one of the major grievances that emerged on the conservative right in the 1970s was that the regulatory state in the US was becoming too big, too aggressive, and too intrusive into the private sphere and the private sector, the private economy. So what you had here was limited government regulations from a libertarian perspective, or strong moral or potentially religious regulations. And this is also where we see the rise of what we call the religious right in the 1970s and 80s. You could see, for example, the changes in the Republican Party platform on issues like abortion or the Equal Rights Amendment. And then lastly, the corporatist perspective, which is no social regulations. So they don't like environmental, workplace, pro-union regulations or pro-consumer regulations, but they do like business regulations. I mean, this is one of the most important things to recognize about the corporatists. The corporatists do not oppose regulation. they support regulation that favors and helps business. And this is a position that they started taking in the 1970s, which they had been taking essentially for the previous 100 years prior to that. So, for example, if you look at business positions on regulatory policy from, say, the 1870s to the 1970s, you see that there's always kind of a give and take and a dynamic interaction between business and the regulatory state. But there isn't the belief that regulation is fundamentally all bad. Regulation only really becomes somewhat problematic in the United States in the business community in the 1960s and 70s, when things like the EPA are created, and now regulations mean that you have to regulate toxic waste and air pollution and water pollution and things like that. So that's what was called, again, no social regulations. They don't like those, but they do like business regulations. That is, they do like regulations that regulate the business community and the economy. Okay, so now where does Project 2025 fall into this? Well, like I said before, it's not new, and it's also not technically, the Project 2025 is what it's called now, but it's actually called the Mandate for Leadership. The Project 2025 is actually just like you'll see actually they've changed the name multiple times. Like I mentioned, it's actually the 9th edition. The first one was published in 81, 84, 88, 96, 2000, 2004, 2016, 2020, and then this is the Project 2025 was now published now in I think it originally came out in 2023. But for example, if you see the 2021, that one, I think that might even been called Project 2020, but it was Mandate, 2020. They changed the name, various different things. Like, for example, in 2000, they renamed it the Keys to Success for the presidency. In 2004, they called it a Mandate for Leadership, and now it's just Project 2025. So let's go back to the original one. So I figure, hey, let's unpack what this did, and let's also talk about how do we thread in the Mandate for Leadership with the different factions within the party. So number one, did it talk about limited government? Number two, so was it a libertarian document? Was it a traditionalist document? Did it talk about moral government? Did it talk about business government? Well, this one was heavily, disproportionately, almost exclusively to some extent, although the document's about 1,000 pages long. I've read through most of it. It overwhelmingly favors a corporatist perspective. Its primary function was to combat and capture and remake the regulatory state. That was its function. As I mentioned before, where did it come from? Well, it was originally published in January 1981 by the Heritage Foundation. I'm happy to go into the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation is by its own definition. I've been to the Heritage Foundation. I've talked to people. They describe themselves as unabashedly conservative, quote unquote. That's how they describe themselves. When I've been in seminars at their headquarters down in DC, that's how they describe themselves. They was established in 1973. I'm happy to go into great length or in any detail you want about the Heritage Foundation. They are the primary movers. In fact, they originated this. The Board of Trustees of the Heritage Foundation in 1979 said that they needed a high-level plan of action for the next conservative president. And that's where the mandate came from. The drafting was originally done in close collaboration with the Reagan campaign and administration. In the summer of 1980, Ed Meese, who was a deputy campaign manager for Reagan, basically gave his quote unquote blessing to the draft that was coming out of the Heritage Foundation in the summer of 1980. It was then provided to the Reagan team, in the fall, and then it was made public in 1981. Now, the thing that you got to remember that the goal here is not. This is one of the things important. The goal of the mandate is not necessarily to shrink government. It is to remake it in a conservative vision. And again, just quoting from it's different. It was an agenda. Plan was to create a conservative agenda and a detailed blueprint for the next conservative president. And so I'll say the original mandate did not necessarily call for smaller government, nor did it focus on morality and lifestyle issues. It outlined how the executive branch could remake executive power in the regulatory state in a way to protect and promote business interests. I mean, that absolutely was its overt focus. So if you think about this in the three factions I've identified, it was not necessarily a libertarian or a traditionalist document. It was a corporatist document. And that's why there's a reason why the context is important about the different factions within the Republican Party, because there are different perspectives within the Republican groups. They're different. They don't always agree. They have a different view of government. And this particular document in its origin was leaned towards corporates. I'm not saying it didn't have any of the other elements. And the Heritage Foundation itself was an organization that probably leaned more on the traditionalist and corporatist perspective than the libertarian perspective. Many books have been written about this, and many more books will be written about this. But in my analysis, the libertarian aspect or faction became less powerful to some extent in the mid-1970s when the traditionalists and the corporatist one became more powerful. So that's kind of one of the things that just like you saw within the party, the different factions move around, and that also happens within different sub-factions within conservatism. So this is an important slide because you're going to see this. There's an enormous amount of continuity between, well, I should say there's a lot of change, significant amount of change, but in certain core areas, there's a significant amount of continuity between all of these editions. So for example, the primary goal initially was regulatory reform, or as the Reagan administration called it, regulatory relief. So how are they going to do this? And this is direct quotes from the original mandate. They use the appointment power wisely when selecting agency personnel. Act promptly to fill vacancies and find persons of high quality and a friendly persuasion. And more specifically, the single most important qualification, however, must be that the appointee shares the general philosophy and outlook of the president. So that's from page 701 of the original mandate. And you're going to see that theme. So we have appointment power, people who are ideologically aligned with the party, with the president, as being the most important variable. Because as the current 2025 project says, personnel is policy. If a president wants to implement an agenda, they have to, from this perspective of this manual, recruit and retain political appointees as well as civil servants in the throughout the federal bureaucracy that are ideologically aligned and committed to the view, to the vision, the agenda, and the policy agenda of the president. So just to show you here just a snapshot of what the original table of contents looked like. So you could see right away the focus on the regulatory state, executive branch, the cabinets, and then the independent regulatory agencies, point by point. And you'll see chapter 14 there, regulatory reform and overview. I mean, the objective again in that time, regulatory reform. Now this is similar. Let's look at Project 2025, right? Taking the reins of government. These are some of the most substantive chapters in 2025, executive branch, then they look at national security, and then they look at regulatory agencies. And they even have another section on the independent regulatory agencies. But that's what it's doing, right? And so you can see the continuity between the original one and the most recent one. Now, I'm not going to go in a little more detail here. The 1981. So what was the goals? Deregulation, ideological appointments, executive power. I mean, that's probably the most important thing. This is really about reclaiming executive power. Now, one of the interesting contexts here is there's a bigger debate in the United States post the Vietnam War about reclaiming executive power. So you can see that you look at several of the significant personalities like Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld and others that were in the Ford administration in the mid-1970s, and they were all concerned about, well, how do we reclaim executive power after the Vietnam War, and particularly the Watergate debacle and the resignation of Richard Nixon in 1974. So what else? Limiting public power. And a new class of, and addressing or limiting the power of what's called a new class of government elites. This was another term that was emerging. And I should mention, too, that the heritage is part of another phenomenon that was going on in the 1970s called the rise of the new right. There was, the right was quite powerful in the 60s. There was an emergence after Nixon, to some extent, called the new right. And that was one of their terms, the new class of government elites. and then also aiding private power. So they want to limit public power, government power, the public sector, and in the interest of an expansion of the private sector. Okay, so now sorry, this says 1981, but that's a mistake. Now what I want to do is I want to take the Project 2025 and I want to run it through the filter that we've developed around a factional analysis. So our analysis of the different factions: libertarianism, traditionalism, and corporatism. So libertarianism. So how much does this document talk about limited government? I mean, it's there. It's definitely there. The real solution for the national government is to do less, from page 83, to decentralize and to privatize. The great challenge confronting a conservative president is the existential need for an aggressive use of the vast power of the executive branch. Now, it sounds a little bit like, well, wait a minute, is that consolidating power at the national level? No, but to return, what they would say, but to return, the goal is to return power to the American people. Now, I'm going to tell you, when you study politics, you always have to ask yourself, whenever they refer to the American people, like, what does that mean exactly? I'm happy to go into great length with that. There's two actors that are often referenced that it's not clear. Well, one of them is a little bit more clear, and that is the states. Often they will say something about, back in the 1980s, they called it new federalism. Now they call it cooperative federalism. But there's all this idea of returning power to the states. That's one thing. But then it also requires some elaboration. But then there's also this question of returning power to the people. And that one's like, well, what exactly does that mean? I think it's a fair question. But now, okay, so now we went from the libertarians, now going into the traditionalists. So what's in there for them? Look at it. So this is where, how much does it talk about moral government? Now, if the original one, and I think it would be an interesting analysis on its own to see how these documents have changed to kind of actually quantify the change. This document now is leaning much more towards, or incorporating, I should say, more traditionalist ideas, and mixing them with some of this contemporary rhetoric about notions of like wokeness and things like that. So look at America under the ruling and cultural elite, which there's another question which is interesting, like elites and how elites are defined. Because if you notice that I said before with the original project, they said a new class of government elites, and targeting the regulatory state and this kind of stuff. So the idea is that ruling and cultural elites, so cultural elites is broader than government to some extent, but this idea of a political elite, so government elites, Trump referred to it as like the deep state concept, that there are these career people in government that have a lot of power. They become elites. In that narrative. So he says, okay, what are these people doing? There's inflation is ravaging family budgets, drug overdoses, and then children are suffering from toxic normalization of transgenderism. So this is not a new discussion. It's had different variations in kind of conservative thought for almost half a century. But the contemporary references to transgenderism and drag queens and this kind of stuff. So and then similarly things like this. This is from the section on the intelligence community. That's what IC stands for. Future IC leadership must address the widely promoted woke culture that has spread throughout the federal government. And they have to address that, and with promoting things like identity politics and social justice advocacy, replace it with traditional American values of patriotism, colorblindness, and workplace competency. So remember, the traditionalist belief structure is a belief in kind of a certain kind of social order, social hierarchy, religious faith, family structures, a very powerful group within the Republican Party. But note, for example, I'll just be very clear, they don't always get along with the libertarians who, because, for example, the traditionalists will want government to be in the business of promoting a certain lifestyle. This is what we see here. For example, like they're talking about specific family structures. For example, what is a family? It's comprised of a married mother, father, and their children are the foundation of a well-ordered nation and a healthy society. So this is very in keeping with the traditionalist group within the Republican Party. They're willing to use government to promote what they believe like a well-ordered society. Now, again, libertarians in general don't ideologically often support this. They don't want government in their lives. and they would rather have a small government or no government. And they don't want government regulating personal life. So just I pointed out because this is an example of like ideological disagreements within the Republican Party. But traditional beliefs. So continuing with this, things like this. These are the mediating institutions, which is a term that dates to the late 70s. A very famous article written in the Common Sense Journal that was launched by the RNC in the late 1970s. This idea of mediating institutions was also used by Reagan. They serve as the building blocks of any healthy society. Those mediating institutions are things like marriage, family, work, church, volunteer, school. That's what they're talking about. They're saying these intermediate between government and there's government, I was going to say in the home, but they're talking about family and marriage. But they're just saying these things that are outside of government, like marriage, family, community, that kind of thing. These are the things that, from a traditionalist perspective, tie society together. A number of very strong positions opposed to abortion in this Project 2025. U.S. government should not and cannot promote or fund abortion, international programs. Biden declared a radical assault on the policy of protecting life, choosing instead to promote abortion on demand around the world. So this is another core belief structure that's emerged within the Republican Party post the original Roe decision in 1973. And I mentioned before, for example, the RNC's policy platform changed on this issue. You see, between 1976 and 1984, it changed quite dramatically. It became much, much more prominently pro-life and opposed to abortion. So again, here, HHS should be rooted in a deep respect for innocent human life. Abortion is not healthcare. So these are some of these pieces. So what you're seeing some libertarian ideas, and you're seeing a stronger push, I'd probably argue, for traditionalist ideas in the Project 2025. And then the corporatist piece, which is, again, probably the core part of this. What is the problem with government? Regulatory agencies. And I remember, go right back to what we were talking about in 1981. Congress' decade-long tendency to delegate its authority to agency bureaucracies. The pervasive notion of expert independence that protects so-called expert authorities from scrutiny. This is one of the things. These agencies were established, most of them, by Congress to have certain mandates. And then they are then supported and sustained by career civil servants who are experts in their subject area. They're by profession, not partisan. They're not political appointees. They will be in sometimes government for a career, so they work through multiple administrations. So this is a direct critique, because the thing that the corporatists don't like is they don't like the power of the government being used to regulate them. They do not mind if regulatory agencies help them. They do mind if regulatory agencies have a public mandate to say regulate the environment or the workplace. They don't like that. There was a famous saying from Reagan. He said, it was the 9 of the most terrifying words in the English language was, I'm here from the government. I'm from the government and I'm here to help. I always think that's an interesting quote, because what Reagan was trying to argue was that poor people who are on social welfare programs, they would be terrified if a government social worker showed up and said, I'm going to take over your life. That may be true. These people may have, they may have wanted support from the government without them breaking up their families or taking away their kids or whatever. But what's also interesting is you ask yourself, if that same government employee, so instead of knocking on the door of a low-income person, walked into a corporate boardroom and said, I'm from the government and I'm here to help, do you think those words would be scary? And I can tell you, if you research corporate America, the answer is no, not at all. Their response would be, where did you go? And what took you so long to get back here? You spent the last decade on some foolishness called social regulations about trying to promote the public interest. when you really should have been here working to promote our interests. I mean, that is absolutely what the corporatist faction within the Republican Party wants. They want a regulatory state that favors them. Because, you know, they're many of them would say, hey, we are business elites, we are business savvy. We're not governed by ideology. We don't care about theories of competitiveness and the free market. We care about surviving economically, and we care about making profits, and that is our goal, and that is our objective, and that is our focus. And if you can set up a regulatory policies that help us in that objective, we have no problem with that. What we have a problem with is that if you get in the way of that, we don't like that. So that you can really see this coming out quite strongly. The presumed inability to hold career civil servants accountable. The increasing reality that many agencies are not only too big and powerful, but increasingly weaponized against the public. And now, see, this is, again, whenever you see the word public in government, you always have to ask, who are they referring to? Who is the public? You know, so this idea that, like, so look at this. Increasingly, the reality is that agencies are too big and too powerful. The way that power works in the United States is that there's two main sources of power. There's public power, and its greatest manifestation is the federal government. But that's public power. But there are other types of power, notably private power, and its greatest current historical manifestation is in transnational corporations. And in fact, much of government policy is really a brokering between those two actors, between federal government, because to tell you the truth, in this conflict, states are too small often. That's why actually corporations like states' rights, because they can deal with them much more effectively than the federal government. The only organization in the world at this point that can counter transnational corporate power are governments, large governments. And so, I mean, that's just the nature of the global economy that we're dealing with. And then when I say, you know, national governments, but there are also these things like the EU, and, you know, the history of international government is not, well, you know, I'd say beyond the nation state. So like we have some things like the UN, all that stuff, but mostly we have these kind of co-associational systems like the EU. Those are what I'm talking about. Big nation states and interacting with large corporations that operate internationally. Much public policy is really made between those two actors. And so what you're seeing here is that this is a corporate perspective saying government is too big and they're becoming too powerful. And we would like the public to be sympathetic to our point of view. It's a very well-established trope for them to say, we are doing this in the interest of the public. That is, like, we're saying, hey, government's too big, it's too intrusive on the public. You know, I mean, you know, effectively both sides say that, of course, like the left and the right say that, you know, way we're doing for the public interest. But it's often for more specialized, coherent interests. A president today assumes office, finds a sprawling federal bureaucracy that all too often is carrying out its own policies and preferences. So this is the idea that, like, all right, so how do we get control of this federal bureaucracy? Again, one of the few systems on this planet capable of countering corporate power. How do you contain it? Well, you have to prop up a more powerful executive branch. That's, you know, the modern conservative president's task is to limit control and direct the executive branch on behalf of the American public. And so again, what does this mean? You know, so much of the Project 2025 and the Mandate for Leadership has been targeting, say, the EPA, for example. You know, the EPA was created by Richard Nixon. It was an executive order by Richard Nixon that created the EPA. And NOAA, also created by Richard Nixon. They have felt as though that agency is too strong and too powerful since its inception. In fact, it was designed from the beginning to be weak, to tell you the truth. NOAA was specifically built. Then the agency NOAA was established in the United States government to limit and check the EPA. Because, for example, if you look at NOAA, NOAA is part of the Department of Commerce, and it was specifically designed that way because in the Nixon administration, they were concerned, yes, they created the EPA, but they were concerned that it would have too much power and too much control over the business community and the private sector and corporate interests. So since that time, you've seen this rhetoric of this agency, which is mandate is to protect public health, should be curbed in the interest of the public. I mean, that is the core message. We need a powerful president to curb federal agencies whose mandate is to protect the public. So they have to be curbed to protect the public. That's the argument. So again, let me just state. So agencies that were established to protect the public are being described as something that needs to be curtailed in the interest of the public. And I'm happy to elaborate on that, and I hope people have questions about it. So, all right, how do we get to this? How do we get to control of the executive branch? Well, they say personnel is policy. Appoint ideologically aligned agency leadership and personnel. So you may remember when I went back to 1981, I told you, pay attention to this slide. The proposals, there's almost nothing new in 2025 when it comes to the specific proposals about regulating the executive branch. I mean, there's almost nothing new. It's all the same from what they said in 1980. You have to reorganize the executive branch and you have to reform the bureaucracy. Well, how do you do this? The president's appointment power, the president must recognize that whoever holds a government position sets policy. So to fulfill an electoral mandate, they must therefore give personnel management that his, their, they, hers or his, highest priority. Because I will say this, look, I'll tell you something about, now we also discussed the fact that there's been a lot of discussion about the collaboration between Trump, former employees and appointees and Project 2025. Project 2025 and all the mandates from the beginning, you'll notice they always just say conservative president. They don't specifically identify a president, because to tell you the truth, when the mandate was originally written, Reagan, the Heritage Foundation didn't actually line up behind Reagan initially. They supported somebody else. And so when they originally wrote the mandate, they were not thinking of Reagan, but then he became the clear nominee. And that tradition kind of continues. So, I mean, any president, regardless of who they are, that was identified as conservative, this is a blueprint for them. So this is the thing, note here, without political leadership, that is without political appointees in these federal agencies, the career civil service becomes empowered to lead the executive branch without democratic legitimacy. So again, what they're saying is that if you don't have a strong executive who appoints people who are committed to that president's vision of government, then the agencies might proceed according to the mandate that they were given by Congress. So for example, like the EPA, if you don't put people in there to curtail the operation of the EPA, then it might go ahead and try to implement its mandate to protect the environment. And that's what the history shows decisively. That when again, we've got 43 years of history here. The implementation of this vision, of a corporatist vision about government, is curtailing the regulatory agencies in the absolute interest of the business community. And the evidence on this is titanic. I mean, it's just enormous because, again, we have almost 50 years. I mean, the Reagan administration alone produced tens of thousands of pages of congressional testimony on what this system of government looks like. I'll just give you one taste of it. The first EPA administrator was Ann Gorsuch. She's actually Neil Gorsuch's mother. If you're interested, look at the congressional testimony on Ann Gorsuch between 1981 and 1983. There's literally thousands of pages of what this model of government looked like. So any new administration will need a full cadre of sound political appointees from the beginning if it expects to direct the enormous federal bureaucracy. Now, I know I'm probably getting short on time, so maybe I'll be quick. They have to weaken public service sector unions. They have to empower the OMB and the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. Not new. The first executive order signed by Ronald Reagan in February 1981, said exactly the same thing. Exactly. And in fact, Reagan wasn't even the first. Every president from Nixon to Reagan. So let's go through this. Ford, Carter, Reagan. All of them signed executive orders to gain more control over the regulatory state. Because I also want to make this clear. Corporate power doesn't just influence the Republicans. They disproportionately also influence the Democratic Party in the United States and have for decades. The Carter's goal on this stuff was not significantly different, and he tried to set up much more aggressive. In fact, the aggressive state apparatus, federal regulatory apparatus that Reagan set up was based on the template established by Carter. So that is the more aggressive executive branch control over the regulatory agencies in the interest of the business community that Reagan pursued was really kicked off by Carter. Okay, so let me just, I guess I mentioned NOAA. I just think it's kind of interesting that NOAA was, because most of the Nixon administration was openly opposed to the EPA. And so what did they do? He said, I'm going to go ahead and do it, but they curtailed it. I mean, at that time, there were about something like 60 agencies in the federal government that regulated the environment. So he consolidated 10 of them, left 50 plus of them outside of the EPA, and created other agencies, because the whole idea from the very beginning was that we'll do this, but the business community has so much lobbying influence in the United States, and has for the last 150 years, that it's almost unprecedented to see anything come out of the U.S. government that isn't vetted, even written by the business community. This includes things like Obamacare. I mean, the scope of their influence is breathtaking and hard to describe. But what you're seeing is just their perspective. A conservative EPA must delegate things to the states. Again, in the 1980s, they called it new federalism. Now they call it cooperative federalism. Nothing is different. It's hard to describe. Last one here, the Biden administration has targeted politically disfavorable industries, pesticide, chemicals. These are all the exact same industries that were fighting the EPA from its inception and continue to do so. One thing I will say about it, though, is if you go back and look at the environmental record in the United States before the EPA, and even in the first 10 years of the EPA, it's absolutely appalling. I mean, stunning. Some of the environmental degradation that was going on was absolutely, you would be shocked. Because it's stuff that doesn't happen in the United States anymore, but because it's just not legal anymore. But I mean, there were entire towns in the United States that were covered in 3 or 4 feet of asbestos. Entire towns, and they had families, children living there, and they didn't do anything about it. So last thing I'll say, sources. I'm happy to provide any more sources. I've written at least one book on this subject. This is where I'll end. And I hope you appreciate it, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Brian. That was really enlightening. And I'm getting some questions here about how. Do you mind turning your share off?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. Of course.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Really about how it doesn't make sense. Sort of like.
Yeah.
What's the purpose of this extreme executive power to turn have the EPA not be able to do what it wants to do? Does the Project 2020 just they want to get rid of those agencies?
Basically, I mean, it doesn't want to get rid of them. Some of them, of course, Department of Education, for example, has been long targeted. I mean, you have to think about this: is that it's the idea of who does the government work for? Does it work for the public, or does it work for business interests? So this document, Project 2025, is simply the business community saying it should work for us. Mm-hmm. But of course they can't come out and say that. Rhetorically, they just, I mean, they do, but they understand that people, in the advertising world, they have something called third-party advocacy. It's like when you buy toothpaste, they don't say, this toothpaste company thinks it's great. They say that four out of five dentists recommend. So it's well established within, the advertising community that you have to have what's called at least some type of third-party advocacy. That some group, that you're a disinterested party, that you want this in the interest of just the general public or something like that. But really, what it comes down to is this business community, this most activist group of the business community, they just want government to function for them. And they would say that, by the way, that's how it used to be. Mm-hmm. They would say up until the 1960s and 70s, with brief periods of interruption, like with the progressive period, they would say that's what it was. That's what government was. It functioned for us. And they'd like to go back to it.
Well, that brings up this question about that the Project 2025 policies are not popular. So how did Project 25 supporters respond to the fact that they're not popular? Do they need a strong executive because they can't get these policies passed using democratic means? People like clean air, consumer protections, etc.
Yes, that's a great observation. I mean, I have a term I'll call it inverted populism. Traditionally populism was elements of elites mobilizing the public to counter other elites. I mean, let's just be clear about, for example, you have elites in government who would mobilize the public to check primarily other economic elites. So what's happening now is inverted populism. So what you have is you have elites mobilizing the public to target groups that have less power, not more power. And so what's happened is they've shifted the focus from concerns about private corporate power, which, by the way, used to be widespread in the United States. People understood that business groups were powerful and they had significant influence in the United States. That was widely understood through most of the 20th century in every region of the United States. But what the business community understood, particularly in the late 60s and 70s, is that they started to understand that because of growing public disaffection with everything big government, that they could shift public opinion and say, no, the problem is not big private power. The problem is big public power. And so they shifted public attention away from private corporate power towards public power, and said that government, as Reagan said, government is not the solution, government is the problem. That was his argument. But what he's saying is that he wants the public to think about government as the problem, not the solution. To the business community, it's the exact opposite. They're the solution, not the problem. But again, like I'd say, the libertarians don't agree with this, right? I mean, libertarians want small government. Traditionalists, again, want like regulatory policies that affect life. But what I'm saying, the mandate for leadership was initially heavily a corporatist document.
Yeah. Right, and it seems like it's sort of switched into being more traditionalist. Is it only because to get the religious right to vote?
That is quite true, because to tell you the truth, I mean, the original mandate for leadership was pretty much a secret document. I mean, it was just written for the Reagan administration, and it was already widely incorporated into their policymaking. It heavily influenced the transition, for when Reagan won and then it was published in 1981. It was like, it wasn't public at the time that it was being implemented in the transition, because its audience is not the public. And I think that's an interesting point. Like, its original audience was not the public. But now, because of, you can get these things on the internet and stuff like that, these books are 1,000 pages long. The mandate for leadership. People don't, I mean, I haven't even read the whole, all of them. I focus on certain areas, just because there's so much detail. And even if you do, you don't retain much of it. It's not for public consumption. It's not the audience. But I think maybe your point is valid, that they now have to kind of suggest it is, or.
Well, they're trying to get things passed. So I have two questions about policy, and I want to remind people to put your questions in the Q&A because it's easier for me to keep track of. And sadly, we won't get to all of the questions, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. So two questions. How much did the mandate influence Reagan's policies, and how much of Trump's policies are based on the mandate?
Yeah, yeah. Well, to tell you the truth, the Heritage Foundation, they can help us with this because after almost all of the, beginning in 1984, they would go public with their interpretation of how much of the mandate had or had not been implemented. So since 1984, the Heritage Foundation has actually been tracking it. So for example, in 1984, they said that 60% in their assessment had been implemented. And what I believe from the Trump administration, they said 2/3. They said in their analysis that 2/3 had been implemented.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, this thing is, I know that when this became public, it created somewhat of an issue, and there was some distancing, there was some leadership change, and that's consistent because it's not a public mandate, if you will. I mean, and look, and from a pluralistic perspective of government, this is what government is. Like different groups vie for influence, and this is just one group. That is disproportionately powerful because it's disproportionately well financed. That's competing in the public arena to shape policy. They are unmistakably the most powerful lobbying and influence and special interest group in the country. And this is a legacy document for them.
Wow.
I mean, one other thing I would put out there too is, for example, there's a very significant memo that was written in the early 1970s. It's now public. It originally was not. It was confidential. Written by Lewis Powell, who then became a member of the Supreme Court. And it's called the Powell Memo. So if you look that up, Powell, the Powell Memo, it was a confidential brief written for the Chamber of Commerce about how the business community could assert more political power in the United States. And they were responding to the fact that Powell was responding specifically to the movements, the social movements of the 1960s, and what he saw as hostility to the business community. And I would say the Powell Memo played a very significant role prompting the major original donors to the Heritage Foundation to start the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation was started initially by $250,000 donation from Joseph Coors.
The beer guy?
Yes. Yeah. There was a saying in the 1970s that there was another guy named Scafie, Richard Scafie, from the Mellon family, the Gulf oil people. They said that Coors, when he gave you money, he gave you a six-pack. Scafie got the whole case. The amount of money. Coors gave in the hundreds of thousands. The Scafies gave in the millions.
Wow. That's
the
amount of money. Do the Democrats have anything similar to this? Like a document that they kind of go by?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Certainly, I'll tell you, since 1968, when Nixon built essentially the first modern presidential party campaign, and actually the Republican Party became the first fully modern political party, the Democrats have gone through periods of either ignoring what the Republicans do and then desperately trying to catch up with them. I'll give you an example. Between the early 1960s and the late 1990s, the Republican Party raised more money from small end, like $10, $25 donors, than the Democratic Party did. They pioneered almost all the modern forms of advertising and party building and all that stuff, and then the Dems periodically try to mimic them. But what the Republicans do is they always professionalize, if you will. They really do. They create a much bigger institutional structure. So, for example, when they took over Congress in 1994, they looked at what the Dems had been doing with all their kind of lobbying, and they were like, that's like amateur, and we're going to do it on a much, much more advanced scale. And they launched something called the K Street Project. That's another thing. The K Street Project started in 1994. And what that was to capture K Street, the lobbying community in Washington, and use it to promote the Republican agenda. Dems had done that, but never systematically.
It feels like that's where we are right now, where the Dems are trying to catch up to, years of not paying attention.
Obama 2008 was a huge jump for the Dems. And that's what you see. But they have the Democrats have a hard time institutionalizing their gains, if you will. Like once they learn how to do things, they often don't maintain it, if you will. Anyway, sorry.
Shocking. One of the things you mentioned was that corporations have become really multinational, and so one of the questions is what happens as U.S. business and its controlled shift to international basis and moves jobs offshore? Does that affect the corporatist vision?
It does. You know why? Because like just like parties, there are factions within corporate America.
Mm-hmm.
So that's to remember too. Like, so this is when I say corporatists, these were kind of the more conservative actors within the business community. It's not the entire business community. So I'll give you an example. Most of these conservative corporatists in the 1970s were domestic, labor-intensive, heavy industries like U.S. Steel, and they were very angry at other corporations that were direct foreign investment because they were taking capital out of the United States and putting it and investing in internationally. So there's a lot of conflict there, and that's why what you see is these domestic big corporate actors pressing on government for some relief from the regulatory system, because they're like, hey, look, you can, these people who can build outside the United States, they don't have to worry about environmental regulations, all this stuff. We can't move. They've tried and they have, but again, that was 50 years ago, and they've been systematically, as you said, because the other thing to remember too is that for many actors of the business community, they've never been nationalist. The nation state to them, I mean, to a significant portion of the business community, the nation state was something that disappeared by the 1960s or 70s. They don't recognize international borders. They don't really care about them. Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, they want to move and wherever it's cheaper, and they want to take full advantage of that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the corporatists would be more successful if we weren't dealing with climate change?
It's interesting. What do you mean? I elaborate on that. I mean, I could give you my take. I think what's happened, I think the corporate community has recognized, the situation about climate change is that the evidence is so overwhelming that they're not resisting it anymore. Mm. Again, I would say most of them are not. There's some that are, for sure. But I think that percentage is actually declining dramatically because it's so inescapable. Again, like if you're a business leader, you can't afford to not pay attention to the possibility that this could be as significant as ever, that the scientific consensus is suggesting.
Well, you had said that that strong government is the only thing that can really sort of like oppose strong corporations, but I think that climate change has actually forced them to consider doing things differently because their bottom line is affected.
Yeah. And the thing about it is historically corporations are so totally driven by like quarterly earnings and that kind of structure that it didn't, unless other than the largest ones that really had the money to do this, they didn't look very far into the future. So I think sometimes now this stuff it's so present and they're like, oh, we can't kind of ignore it. So now it's being thrust on them. But I think there's some elements that are still so totally committed to the short term. Mm-hmm. And those are the ones that are like, oh, no, let's just continue to dispute and disregard this as a possibility. Because the interesting thing about conservative thought, actually, is that conservative thought significantly would argue that it's risky to ignore things like that. Mm-hmm. It would be like, if you go back to the stalwarts, like the small business people of the Midwest and the bankers, I mean, those people they're quite savvy and they wouldn't ignore, market conditions or whatever that they would try to plan around it.
Right. So this is actually a bunch of really interesting questions about the unlikability of the candidates and things like that. Given the traditionalists, their position about the moral sense, whatever, and the candidates that are currently out there that are so unlike, like to so many people, very unlikable or go against that. So why is that happening? How is that working with the Heritage Foundation or the mandate in terms of like, allowing for that?
You mean like, so how do we explain the inconsistency between like a strong kind of moral code and like a religious belief and with some of the behavior of candidates? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, thank you. That was much more clear.
You know, there's only one word to answer the question, and the word is power.
Mm,
The only reason why any party particularly likes one candidate over the other, look, let me describe it this way without mentioning any names, is that if the person is either one or is competitive, they're untouchable.
mhm.
Like you look at Trump. Trump broke the blue wall in 2016. He won in these states that Republicans haven't won in since the 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it that the Republican leaders all across the country don't they don't say anything? Because he's won nationally, and he's one of the biggest challenges in politics in the United States is participation. People just don't participate in politics.
Mm-hmm.
People don't like politics. And I tell you something, I live and breathe and study politics, but I've always known that people who don't like politics are almost always better at it. Because they're able to connect. I've worked on campaigns for many, many years. And people who don't like politics are better because they can connect and they understand people who are like, it's fundamental. How is the system not fundamentally corrupt? Why do you want my time and energy? So you have to have responses to that. So I think that's, it's actually not hard to understand the mechanics of, say, Trump's influence within the Republican Party, because he has supporters who are active in every congressional district in the United States. And there's no other candidate who's come down for decades for them that has anything like that. So what you have is you have enthusiastic supporters. If anybody can produce enthusiastic supporters in every congressional district in the United States, it doesn't matter who you are. The party will listen to you.
We have seen that. So I have an interesting question here from somebody who says, with both parties participating in this corporate takeover, yes, how do we get a third party, like the Green Party, let's say, elected?
Yeah. Okay. Great question. The problem is the answer is institutional at two levels. One, because of our system of government, where we have a first past the post, winner take all system, and we don't have proportional representation in, say, Congress, or we don't have a parliamentary system of government. Third parties could be and have been viable in the United States, just not at the presidential level. So the thing about it is, the mistake I think that's made with third parties is to focus on what I call celebrity politics, which is presidential politics. That's not where most politics is in the United States. Most politics is at the precinct level and in neighborhoods and cities and towns across the country. And where you want to build, that's where you want to build. And that's where third party candidates have won. And then what you do is you build an infrastructure based on that. Now, because that's the only way to do it, because even at that local level, in most parts of the country, we still have just single past the post. That is, only one person takes it. Winner take all. So say if you run for state rep or state senate or mayor or something like that. If you run a viable campaign as a third party candidate, you could potentially win. And then when you do, then what you're doing is you're one brick in building a party structure. I'll give you an example. The person who rebuilt the Republican Party after Goldwater's defeat was a guy named Ray Bliss from Ohio. Mm-hmm. Ray Bliss, even when he was the RNC chair, was still his precinct captain. It was a precinct captain in Akron, Ohio. And his argument was, you build a party the same way you build a house, from the bottom up, not from the top down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. I have a question that I think is really a good one because of what's happened recently. Isn't part of this very vast expansion of the executive branch involving stacking the judicial branch to not block unbridled executive action?
Yeah. Yes. So because what we have now is that because of changes in the rules in the Senate, and so that was started by the Democrats back in 2013 because there was so many blocks on Obama's nominations. But at the time, Harry Reid, he limited the rules for 51 to non-Supreme Court nominees. And then when the Republicans took over in 2017, they pushed past that barrier and said no for all. So now you can see that you have a Supreme Court that is, there's a fierce debate, about the filibuster. But what you have is you have nominees and you have a court that would not exist if either party had to win even a small number of the other party. So yeah, so I'm linking that to the Congress, but the question though was about executive. Because it doesn't matter who the president appoints or nominates. It doesn't. It matters, of course, but it doesn't mean they're going to make it.
Right. Well, I guess what's happened more recently is having the 6 conservative judges on the Supreme Court has so dramatically in some way affected the country. So is that part of the heritage mandate, is to strengthen the what you said about having people in civil servant positions that believe in the ideology gives you power. Is that do they also say that about the judicial branch?
That is again a fantastic question. That is a great question. Because what I would say is I think this is interesting, because what's happened is that the focus of the conservative movement has changed historically. For example, back in the mid 20th century, they threw everything in supporting the Congress as a check against the president, because the Congress was much more conservative, particularly the Senate in, say, the 1950s or 40s and 50s. And who were the presidents? It was FDR and Truman, and then even Eisenhower, who, by the way, the conservatives did not like. And he did not like him.
I knew that for some reason.
He had this. Sorry?
I knew that for some reason.
Yeah, I didn't like. Because he was seen as too moderate. He had this term. He had a term called modern republicanism. But no, they did not like him. They didn't like Richard Nixon. The conservatives did not like Richard Nixon either, because they knew that he was. Well, I could go into the details of it, but So they invested back then, mid 20th century, in Congress. And then what happens is post 68, or really Nixon, and then they start to focus on executive power. This is the way to challenge a very liberal Congress. Because remember, the Democrats controlled the Congress from the 1950s into the 1990s. So I think what's happened now is with the Federalist Society, and in the 1980s, there was a shift of the courts now become critical, because the courts were they shifted to being quite liberal in the mid 20th century. So I think this project has been focused on executive power. So the Project 2025, and I think there have been other organizations that have tried to work on the judiciary.
Yep. Yeah. It's people are actually noticing that, which is unusual. I have lots of questions about Christian nationalism. How is that taken over from the traditionalists? Is that more powerful than the traditionalists to have affected the government or the mandate so much?
Yeah, it's again another good question. It's within the traditionalist tradition, so it's within that group, because again, like all of these big groups of people, there are different schools of thought. But traditional conservatism, or the notion of traditionalism, it's interesting. For example, there are some threads in that tradition that directly root themselves in the Middle Ages, for example. So, for example, if you look at some of the writings of conservative intellectuals in the 40s and 50s in the United States after the war, Because one of the things you have to recognize is a big significant debate within conservatism was about who was responsible for fascism. And what the conservatives argued was actually that fascism was a result of too much democracy.
Yeah.
So what they argued actually was what you needed in society was social control, hierarchy. And, you know, more contemporary, like different people have linked this to like family structures. What they would say is you need a strict father model or a strict parent model. You need an, you know, like that in a society that becomes too democratic can become subject to authoritarian leaders. So this is what the conservatives argued. So what society did they look at? Some of these authors were looking into the Middle Ages, the Christian Middle Ages, and saying that they were the ideal society because they were religious and they were hierarchical, and they were almost like a fixed caste system. People knew where they were in society, like people should know where they are in a family hierarchy. You know, there's been a long tradition of referencing like biological references to describe like society, like social classes, like you're the legs and the knees, and you have no right to challenge the arms and the head. So the caste systems and people locked into certain social classes. So there was that appeal. There was appeal to that like social order and hierarchy. And so I think the thing about so that's you know, with the Christian nationalism. So that's where, I mean, so religion in that tradition has always been such a key part of that worldview. And now remember, so that's why they're saying we support an idea of a state imposing a particular way of living. And as I described before, that is very much at odds with other factions. So for example, not only libertarians, but actually often the corporatists too. You know, there's an old tradition in corporate America. They don't care what you do on the weekend, so long as you show up to make money on the weekday.
Right.
They don't care. So if you look at the, you know, this is kind of the Bush family tradition. Like, you know, look at Prescott Bush, and I mean, Prescott Bush was, you know, he was a, I'm not sure, a founding member, or he was a board member of Planned Parenthood. They don't care, again, what you do, so long as you show up and make money for them.
So I just, we're a little bit over time, but I want to ask one last question. Has any country in the world ever had a system like what is in the mandate and been successful?
Okay, so let's see. So what it would be is it would be like a strong corporate state, essentially.
Like an authoritarian figure at the whether
right. Now that's a good qualification, because a strong executive,
right,
who is able to you know, the interesting thing about this is that, you know, both the left and the right have an authoritarian tradition. You know, so you have sometimes called positive libertarianism, and that would be like a stronger state. You know, negative libertarianism is like freedom from, and positive libertarianism is like freedom to. So like freedom to housing, freedom to education, freedom to healthcare. So that's like a state. But then you can have another dimension to this of a right-left divide on the positive libertarian tradition. So for example, you could have a strong, you've had traditions, you know, in the Marxist tradition of these strong authoritarian figures who are essential to topple like the bourgeoisie or whatever. So you know, there's many examples of, because for going back to the Paris Commune of the 1870s, so Marx like arguing that basically the bourgeoisie was not going to relinquish power, so it was going to be like a struggle, and therefore you needed a strong state. And of course there were differences here. There were debates about this, and but a strong state to be able to throw off the bourgeoisie. Now on the opposite side, you know, with like say with a fascist state, those states historically clearly seem to be that, as I saw a comment just came up, industrial corporate complicity seems to be a required check the box to for those systems to thrive, because that's the way they pitch themselves. They're like, we are a classless society. Which it's interesting, so the fascist traditions, they'd be like, we are a classless society, and if we liquidate like unions and anyone that we create a national union or whatever, and then you create a labor class purely, they don't challenge hierarchy.
I guess I'm thinking about those countries that are considered fascist here, like Russia, Venezuela, Hungary. They don't seem super successful in the sense that people are protesting the way that the government is run. So they're not successful in that either, but that they've lost the ability to make decisions for themselves, that the authoritarian has taken over.
I mean, because one of the things your question is getting at, so it's interesting. So like, because, okay, if you have a strong state, some people would argue, look, if you have a strong state, it's either going to be controlled by private sector or it's going to be controlled by somebody else, and the strong state is the problematic variable. I mean, this is a very strong tradition of decentralized power in the United States and that kind of stuff, and that's kind of what they're arguing is like, hey, you just can't have a strong national structure because one way or another it's going to abuse some groups in society. I think there are enough. The fact is that if you look at the operation of, again, the regulatory state, if you look at, say, like the EPA or whatever, it's a perfect example. I mean, it really is a product of competing interests. So it was propped up, but it was limited from the beginning, and then it actually performed quite well. I mean, it was pretty effective for the first decade. It was quite effective, and again, many people in the business community were like, oh, it's reasonable and all that stuff. And then they, it was just that some actors were like, no, we got to go after it. And then the other thing they would do, this is more important too, is small business. And when big business, big business has really always tried to claim that it represents small business, but routinely it does not. And often laws, and this is kind of constructive feedback, right? Is that you could set up regulatory policies that are different for small and big businesses. But what's happened is that because big businesses don't want it, they've similarly trying to rally a constituency in the public. They've rallied a constituency amongst small businesses as well. Even though you could solve that by differences in policy, but so maybe the last comment I'll make is that for politics in the United States to be successful, it has to become majoritarian, right? It has to appear like it's has a broad base of support in the public. And that's always was the challenge for the business community. They were like, how do we create a majoritarian base when we represent a very, very small percentage of people?
They have lots of money, so they've had some.
And the way to do it is to say that we're not the threat, the government's the threat.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Wow, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much. In the comments and so many questions still left over. We'll have to do it again, Brian, and just do a Q&A. What do you think?
I'd love to do it. I'd love to answer any question. Because the reality is that I feel like I learned more, from the give and take than anything else.
Yeah, we had some really great questions. I appreciate everybody being here and listening in and sharing your thoughts with us. And just remember to go vote. That's what matters in the next 2 weeks.
Absolutely.
Brian, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yep. Have a great night, everybody.
Yeah, bye.